So I've been running a series off and on my channel for a while called Terrible Pokemon Theories That Actually Make Perfect Sense. And that pretty much explains itself. I cover theories that are super crazy to the point where they are not realistically true at all, but even still, they make a lot of sense, which makes them fun to talk about. And I've brought this series back for another episode because I have some more amazingly terrible theories to share with you guys today. So let's check them out. Okay, so this episode is, fittingly enough, going to be Kalos themed, as I sort of stumbled upon these theories while doing all the research I've been doing recently for Pokemon Legends ZA. There's also just 2 theories this episode instead of the usual 3, but I must say, these theories are pretty good. They're still in a terrible theories video because they are pretty crazy at the end of the day, but to me, they're good enough that they almost convince you that they're just straight up good theories, so this should be a lot of fun. This first one is, point blank, the idea that fairy-type Pokemon do not naturally exist within the Pokemon world. Big claim to make, I know, but here's kinda why I buy the idea. First off, fairy types just straight up did not exist until Generation 6. Obviously, we know the real-world explanation for that, but in terms of the in-universe lore, they kinda just appeared one day when we arrived in the Kalos region, which lines up with this idea. Within Kalos, which is basically like the home region of fairy-type Pokemon, is Laver City, which is the fairy-type place within the region that introduced fairy-type Pokemon. It's home to the first ever fairy-type gym leader in Valerie, and in general just gives off major fairy tale-like vibes, to where it is obviously an intentional theme for the city. Essentially, it's like the fairy-type capital of the Pokemon world almost. And with that in mind, and with this theory in mind, let's take a look at some in-game descriptions of Laver City. Its slogan is, the city of otherworldly dreams, and then looking at its map description, it reads, an unearthly city created by those inspired by a mysterious and ancient tree 1500 years old. So, the city that is essentially the mecca of fairy-type Pokemon is being described in-game as otherworldly and unearthly, which definitely lines up big time with the idea that fairy-type Pokemon are not naturally from the Pokemon world. If fairy types don't come from the Pokemon world though, where do they come from, and how did they get here? Well, an answer to that question seems to also lie within Laver City itself. The central landmark of Laver City is a tree that sits in the middle of town, which was mentioned previously in Laver's map description. The Laver City gym was built around this tree, and near the top of this gym, on the outside, sits a large clock. This isn't just any clock though, because if you look closely, you can see that it has 13 hours on it instead of the standard 12. This is obviously pretty unusual, but it also, naturally, was not just put there in the game for no reason. This 13th hour is a likely reference to the 13th hour in folklore, or the witching hour more specifically. This is an hour when it is said that supernatural beings are able to appear in our own world, and when the veil between our world and that of the supernatural is at its most thin, and that is where this all comes together. Laver City recognizes this 13th hour, hence why they have it on their clock. The 13th hour is also when supernatural, fairy tale-like creatures are said to be able to appear in our own world, and this city is also basically the capital city for fairy types in the Pokemon world, which did not exist until Generation 6 when Laver City first came along. So with all of this in mind, it stands to reason that fairy types may not actually occur or exist naturally in the Pokemon world, and instead they came here from some other world or dimension via Laver City, when the Pokemon world crossed over with this supernatural realm during that 13th hour. This would explain their sudden introduction in Gen 6 despite not existing prior to that, and then from there, fairy types were likely able to just live amongst other Pokemon and sustain themselves, which in turn created other fairy types, not only through breeding, but also through exposure to their supernatural energy, which could explain why some already existing Pokemon, like Meryl, gained the fairy type at this time. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, I know, but this seems to be what the actual Pokemon world itself is pointing us in the direction of in terms of an explanation, which is honestly pretty wild. Alright, now we're going to, funnily enough, talk about the fairy type's exact opposite in Dragon, and more specifically, one Dragon-type Pokemon in particular, Noivern. This next theory asserts that Noivern, and possibly Avalugg as well, who we'll get into a bit later, were originally going to be pseudo-legendary Pokemon, but then that idea was scrapped for some reason, and we ended up with Goodra as Kalos' pseudo-legendary instead. This idea simply begins with the fact that everything about Noibat and Noivern, on the surface anyway, screams pseudo-legendary. They are dragon types, as we mentioned. Their designs are very, very consistent with the type of appearance that other pseudo-legendaries have, and they even sit right next to the actual Kalos legendaries in the Pokédex, which is another very pseudo-legendary-like trait. Additionally, another really interesting point that goes along with this is that Drasna, the Kalos Elite Four member who specializes in the Dragon type, is currently the only Dragon type specialist who has never at any point used a pseudo-legendary. And yet, Noivern is her ace Pokemon when you battle her at the Pokemon League. In addition to all of this as well, Noivern also happens to sit next to Bergmite and Avalugg in the Pokédex, and this is where they come into play. These two not only sit next to each other in the Pokédex like I just said, but they're also both two-stage Pokemon and both have similar base stat totals in both of their evolutionary stages. So while not true counterparts to one another, they do have a lot of things about them that line up with one another, which makes this next point all the more interesting. I've mentioned in previous videos how there is evidence within the data of Pokemon X and Y for a cut middle evolution of Bergmite and Avalugg. This is because the models of the Kalos Pokemon have a unique index order within the data of those games, and there is a missing model in this order that sits between Bergmite and Avalugg, which is likely a cut middle stage of this line given this information. So, due to this and the similarities between these two lines that I mentioned earlier, is it possible that Noibat and Noivern could have also had a cut middle evolution as well, or potentially even another evolution, which was a part of their original plan as pseudo-legendary Pokemon? Another interesting parallel with this that makes it even more interesting to think about is the idea that Avalugg could have possibly been a pseudo-legendary originally as well. If it does in fact line up with Noivern like this, that is what you would naturally have to expect, and two pseudo-legendaries in one generation isn't exactly unheard of, because it has happened before in Generation 3, aka the Hoenn games, which just so happened to receive remakes in Generation 6, which tied the Hoenn region very closely together with that of Kalos. So, giving Kalos two pseudos to parallel Hoenn's two pseudos, which was already going to be Kalos' sister region anyway with the remakes, is not actually all that far-fetched, especially when you consider that these Pokemon also mirror Hoenn's pseudo-legendaries in terms of their designs. You have Noivern and Salamence, for instance, which are the classic traditional Dragon-type pseudos, and then you have Metagross and Avalugg, who are both these bulky, kind of lumbering, four-legged, non-dragon Pokemon. Again, you can call it a conspiracy theory if you want, and I did put it in a terrible theories video for a reason, but there is a lot here that does feel like it lines up if you ask me, which is honestly pretty fascinating given the claim that this theory is making. What do you guys think about these theories though? Do you think they actually make perfect sense, or are they just terrible? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe for more if you're new. You can also support the channel further if you would like by checking out my Pokémon remixes on Spotify or wherever you get your music. That honestly helps out a ton, and you can also check out my Patreon if you want to, which is linked in the description below. There's tons of cool perks offered there, like voting on videos you want to see, ad-free videos, and even sneak peeks and behind-the-scenes looks at my Histrobi Chronicles monster catching video game that I'm currently working on. Any and all support in either of those places helps the channel out a ton and is super duper appreciated, and honestly just means the world. With that said though, I will be back with another video right here very soon, and until then, as always, thanks so much for watching this one. I really appreciate it, and I will smell you guys later.